Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Now, recently I checked out the VRM design and thermal performance of a number of high-end Z390 motherboards, all priced around $300 US. Now, of the bunch, the Gigabyte Z390 Aorus Master impressed me the most. Asrock's Z390 Taichi Ultimate was also quite good. MSI's Meg Z390 Ace, that was a little bit lackluster, still a good board, but didn't impress me as much as I thought, having come from the godlike. And then we had the Asus ROG Maximus 11 Hero, which also disappointed me a bit based on the results seen from previous Asus motherboards. The Maximus 11 Hero was the worst performer of that comparison. The thermals weren't horrible, but given the price, I suppose the performance was quite disappointing. And then there was the whole issue with is it an 8-phase or is it a 4-phase motherboard? Turns out it is a 4-phase with double the components, so still quite a powerful VRM, though because of the design it did run a bit hotter than expected. Asus have their reasons for why they've gone with that particular design. They believe it is better, so that's something we have to dig into in the future. But yeah, that's that at the moment. Asus have said it was a mistake that it was advertised as an 8+2+2 phase VRM in the US. That was a mistake by the US marketing team, so they're now rectifying that. And once they do, hopefully I can get an official statement for them, and I'll pin that on the previous video, and that will hopefully put an end to that issue. And hopefully we don't see any twin 8-phase marketing BS from Asus in the future. Anyway, with the mystery of the twin 8-phase VRM mostly solved, we can move on to some more testing. And I do plan to test pretty much every single Z390 motherboard, at least every single one I can get my hands on. A few of you have requested we test out the EVGA models. Unfortunately, we don't really get EVGA here in Australia. And despite the fact that about 40% of our viewership do come from the US, EVGA don't seem that interested in sampling us. So maybe we can convince them in the future. But as of now, or for now, we've only got the 4 main brands that we're going to be checking out. So, on hand, we have the Asrock Z390 Pro 4. This is a $130 US model, and I have taken all the heatsinks off the boards and haven't put them back for this part of the video. So you're seeing the boards mostly naked. Doesn't really matter, I suppose. Next up, we'll go to, we've got the MSI board. Let's go with that as next, because that's also $130 US, so I'll do them in order of price. Actually, I'm not doing them in order of price. Scrap that. Anyway, I've got the MSI board next. Z390 A Pro. That's that board, $130. Then we got the cheapest board here, the Gigabyte Z390 UD. Looks to be one of the better boards of the bunch. Again, no heat sinks on it, but yeah, $120. Seems like a pretty good buy, that one, for $120. And then the most expensive of them all, the Asus Prime Z390P. Now, Asus, while this is an entry-level board, they don't seem to do entry-level pricing quite like the other 3 brands, and therefore this is a $150 US motherboard. So quite expensive for what it is, but we'll get to the results in a moment. Now, you might be thinking, who's going to pair a sub $150 US motherboard with a $500 plus US Core i9 processor? And well, that's fair enough. I'd say anyone buying or at least trying to buy a brand new 9900K processor today isn't going to pair up with a board priced south of $200 US. However, what if you've only got the budget for a Core i5 or i3 processor today? An affordable Z390 board with basic features seems like a reasonable solution, and it should mean in a year or two you can pick up a 9900K on the sale or second hand and slot that into your existing Z390 motherboard. This is a fairly common scenario. People buy what they can afford now in the hope that they can max it out and upgrade in the future without having to upgrade their entire system. After all, the 4 entry-level motherboards that we're looking at today all officially support the 9900K, so it's not unreasonable to expect that some users might eventually end up using this processor on one of these motherboards. Question is, how well do they support the power-hungry 8-core processor? Before we get to the results, let's just quickly go over each board, starting with the Gigabyte Z390 UD. This board uses the ISL 69138 controller, and from it 5 PWM signals are outputted for the V-core. These signals are then each doubled using the ISL 6617 phase doubler, giving us 10 phases. For the high side MOSFETs, we have On Semiconductor's 4C10N, and on the low side 4C06N. Cooling the board's VRM are a pair of reasonably large anodized black aluminium heatsinks. They aren't properly finned, but they aren't just aluminium blocks either, and both are secured to the PCB using plastic push-pin clips. Next up, we have the Asrock Z390 Pro 4, and this board uses the UP9521P phase controller, though this time we have just 4 PWM signals for the V-core, though each is again doubled, this time using UP1961S phase doublers, giving us 8 phases in total. As for the MOSFETs, on the high side we have Sinopower SM4337, and on the low side SM4336. So, not a bad configuration for a budget board, though you do still need to cool it, and Asrock seems to have forgotten that little fact as they've stuck on the smallest heatsink you're likely ever to find on a Z390 motherboard. I reckon the Intel IHS would have done a better job of cooling these MOSFETs. The heatsink weighs in at just 24 grams, and that's pretty pathetic considering Gigabyte's whacked 108 grams worth of heatsink on their entry-level Z390 board. Next up we have the Asus Prime Z390P, and things don't look that much better here. Sure, we've got some heatsinks, both much bigger and combined tip the scales at 57 grams, but the VRM design itself it's pretty rubbish. As usual, Asus is using their rebranded ASP1400 CTB controller, and as usual, at least for the majority of their Z390 range, they're taking just 4 PWM signals and they aren't doubling them. So then we have a 4-phase VRM with a doubling of components. Like Gigabyte, they are using ON Semiconductor's 4C10N for the high side and their 4C06N for the low side. There's just less of them in total and not even half as many phases. Given that this is by far the most expensive of the entry-level boards, to say that I'm disappointed with what Asus are offering here doesn't really cut it. Anyway, lucky last we have the Msi Z390A Pro, and this is a pretty nice looking board on the surface. We get a nice big heatsink over the V-Core VRM. This monster weighs in at 170 grams, so it is the biggest heatsink of all the entry-level Z390 motherboards. That said, the VRM itself isn't super impressive. Like Asrock, MSI is using the UP9521P phase controller, and they are also taking just 4 PWM signals. However, unlike Asrock, they aren't doubling them, so this is another 4-phase V-Core VRM. On the high side, we have a pair of SM4337 FETs, and on the low side, 2 SM4503 FETs. So it'll be interesting to see how this motherboard performs. Okay, so that's how the boards compare on paper. Just quickly before we get into the results, if you would like to know exactly how I've tested these boards in each configuration, please watch the previous video in this series. I'll provide a link in the video description. It'll probably be a timestamp to where I actually explain how I test on the test bed and inside the case. But I won't go over all that here. Like I said, I'll just put the link because it takes me quite a few minutes to get through all that. So we'll skip that and we'll get straight into the results. So again, if you want to know about that, check the link in the video description. Okay, so here are the stock 9900K results with the boards installed inside the Corsair Crystal 570X with plenty of fans and direct airflow over the VRM. All testing has been conducted with an ambient air temperature between 21 and 22 degrees. Thermals have been measured using K-type thermocouples. I'm measuring the MOSFET surface temperature, labelled as top, as well as the underside of the PCB. Please note the internal MOSFET temperatures are at least 10 degrees higher, usually around 20 degrees higher, so there is quite a difference there. However, we don't use the readouts from stuff like Hardware Info because, well, some of these boards don't give you that information and it's not always accurate. There's offsets and things like that, so it's not a great way of comparing motherboards. Anyway, keeping the internal temperature in mind, which will be higher, you really want to keep the surface temperature below 80 to 85 degrees, as that would mean an internal temperature of around 100 degrees. These components are usually rated to handle up to 125 degrees, but that's the thermal cutoff, and you'll want to stay well away from that. Efficiency is also very poor at those temperatures. You're basically killing the components, and well, degradation is rapidly accelerated. Please note there are 2 test configurations for the Gigabyte Z390 UD, as this board seems to overvolt the 9900K quite badly with the current F3 BIOS that we use for testing. Despite being the best board on paper, with what looks to be the best or close to the best cooling, it actually provided the worst results. However, during the test, I noticed that the 9900K was being fed 1.38 volts, which is far too much even for a 5 GHz all-core overclock. I have notified Gigabyte of this issue, and in the meantime I've set the voltage at 1.26 volts to match the Asus Prime. The end result though under load was about 1.225 volts. The MSI and Asrock boards ran between 1.28 and 1.288 volts, which is a bit higher, but that's what they do on auto. Anyway, we should probably just discuss the results. So the lowest peak MOSFET surface temperature was recorded on the MSI Z390A Pro at just 52 degrees. That said, the backside of the PCB hits 75 degrees, which is certainly getting up there. The reason for the huge variation is due to the fact that MSI boards have a massive heatsink that does a really good job of removing heat from the surface of the FETs, especially when there's plenty of airflow to capture. However, because the MSI board only uses a 4-phase VRM, the components do generate quite a bit of heat, and that's absorbed through the PCB and then isn't dissipated very well, and therefore builds up to around 75 degrees, the result you see here. Now, the Gigabyte Z390 UD dropped an incredible 20 degrees when running the 9900K at 1.225 volts opposed to the 1.38 volts, and this 11% reduction in voltage has a profound impact on how hot the VRM gets. So while the Gigabyte board is a poor performer right now, they should be able to address this with a future BIOS, and that will make it one of the best. Although the MOSFET surface temperature was 9 degrees hotter than what we saw on the MSI board, the PC temperature was 11 degrees cooler, and that is very significant. The Asus Prime Z390P does reasonably well in this test, with MOSFET surface temperatures climbing just a few degrees higher than the Gigabyte model, though the PCB temperature was 10 degrees hotter. Then we have the Asrock Z390 Pro 4, which quite frankly sucked. The VRM design, as we saw earlier, isn't bad, but the tiny little 24-gram heatsink is a complete joke. We're seeing surface temperatures around 80 degrees, and although this board doesn't report VRM temperatures, I suspect the internal temperature is up around 100 degrees. So that's basically a fail in my book. We've got a stock 9900K in a well-ventilated case in a cool room, and the VRM temp using K-type thermocouples is reaching 80 degrees. The results you see here are reported after the load test. I give the boards 10 minutes to cool down, and then I report the current temperature. The MSI Z390A Pro cools down the best, likely thanks to its massive heatsink, and we also saw that the PC temps came right down as well. Then with a bit of voltage tuning, we see that the Gigabyte board also comes down to a similar temperature to that of the Asus and Asrock models. That said, stock using the F3 BIOS, it only cooled down to around 40 degrees. Okay, here are the test bench results with no direct airflow, and you might be wondering what all those red bars are about. Basically, these indicate invalid results. The MSI, Asrock, and Asus boards all suffered VRM throttling, which downclocked the 9900K from 4.7 GHz to around 4.2 GHz. The Asus Prime Z390P began throttling after 6 minutes, at which point it had already reached a MOSFET surface temperature of 100 degrees. The Asrock Z390 Pro 4 began throttling after 7 minutes, when the surface temperature reached 90 degrees, and the MSI Z390A Pro throttled after 8 minutes, hitting just 67 degrees for the surface temperature. I left the boards all running for the hour-long test, but because we were VRM throttling, these boards didn't get that much hotter, though they did continue to run at dangerously hot temperatures. Now, the Gigabyte Z390 UD, using either the optimized voltage settings or the auto voltage configuration, did manage to avoid VRM throttling. That said, it probably should have throttled, as the 1.38 volt configuration got insanely hot, with a MOSFET surface temperature of just over 100 degrees. Even with the optimized voltage, we're still seeing a surface temperature of 80 degrees, which is around 100 degrees for the internal temperature. So really all boards technically failed here, as the surface temperatures were just getting too high. That said, the Gigabyte Z390 UD is right on the edge, and since it didn't throttle and it maintained this surface temperature after the hour-long stress test, whereas the MSI, Asrock, and Asus boards would have all gone up in smoke, I'll give Gigabyte a pass on this one. 10 minutes after running the hour-long load test, these are the temperatures we were faced with. Gigabyte didn't cool down that well, though the results are still decent. The big heatsink on the MSI Z390A Pro saw it cool down the most rapidly on the open-air test bench, while the Asrock and Asus boards also did quite well, despite the fact that it was really only the Gigabyte board that didn't fail this test miserably. Normally I also provide a series of overclocking results, but given the stock performance, I wasn't expecting much from these entry-level boards with the 9900K at 5 GHz. As expected, the Asus, Asrock, and MSI boards all failed this test. They either suffered VRM throttling issues almost right away, or they crashed completely, giving us the blue screen of death. The Asrock and Asus boards couldn't maintain the 1.3 volt 5 GHz overclock and would crash, while the MSI board quickly overheated. The Gigabyte Z390 UD did technically pass this test without any VRM throttling at all, but again with MOSFET surface temperatures of around 80 degrees, it's a questionable pass. For comparison, I have included some higher end Z390 boards that I've already tested, and as you can see, there is quite an extreme difference in the VRM quality. At idle, the Gigabyte board did cool down nicely, and here it is comparable to the Maximus 11 Hero. Then, just to see if I could get the Gigabyte Z390 UD to VRM throttle, I tested it on the open air testbed and let it cook. Surface temperatures hit 101 degrees, and hardware info was reporting a VRM temperature of 126 degrees, and yet the board never throttled with the 9900K. Obviously that's a fail, and even the Maximus 11 Hero is borderline too hot in this test, as the internal MOSFET temperatures are knocking on the door of 100 degrees. Impressively, even with no airflow, the Gigabyte Z390 UD did cool down to a reasonable temperature after 10 minutes. Of course, it failed the load test, but it's good to see when placed under extreme load that it's still able to cool down quite quickly. Well, I think it's fair to say that the entry-level Z390 motherboards are a bit of a scam. I know that's a harsh way of putting it, but I can't for the life of me understand what the point of these motherboards is. The Gigabyte one's reasonable, but the rest of them, yeah, I don't get what the point is. In my mind, the entire point of the Z390 was to signify or show that motherboards donning this particular chipset were locked and loaded, ready for the 9900K. If we look at previous Z370 models, we see that the bulk of them, the lower end models from MSI, Gigabyte, Asus, Asrock, they all featured 4-phase VRMs, and most of them will really struggle. I've actually done some testing and found they really struggle with the fully unleashed 9900K, which is the out of the box and not the 95 watt TDP limited, power limited setup that we have actually tested on the channel. Anyway, we could take Gigabyte's range, for example, of their Z370 boards, the Aorus Gaming 7. That's probably the only board that should be okay for long-term use, rendering and whatnot with the 9900K. Everything else is really going to struggle, and yeah, certainly wouldn't be an ideal solution for the new 8-core processor. So we already have low-end affordable Z370 motherboards. We don't need low-end affordable Z390 motherboards. That's not the bloody point of the Z390 chipset. Now, I didn't mean to have this motherboard there. I actually did. I got this board by mistake. I was taking a look at this board as well, but I can make the comparison that I was going to make anyway. So here is the actual MSI board that I've been meaning to talk about all video while I've been pointing at the Z370 board. But this Z390 model has the exact same VRM. So this is the board we tested in the video. Here's the older version. They've got the same 4-phase VRM. This one has a few extra chokes and a bigger heatsink, and for that you pay $10 more. Possibly worth paying $10 more, I don't know. Not really the point, because neither of these boards are really capable of taking full advantage of the 9900K. And, well, yeah, I suppose those buying a 9900K now aren't looking at buying any of these boards. But as I said earlier in the video, make it a year down the track. You've bought this board to use a Core i3 or a Core i5, and now you want to upgrade, and you 10th generation Intel stuff probably won't be compatible with this platform, so your only option would be to get a 9900K, and unfortunately doing that, it's going to put the board under a lot of stress and not get the most out of the 9900K. So I feel like these boards don't need to exist, because you can spend, well, Asus aside, you can spend about, I think it's only about $40 more, $40 to $50 more, and you get a board that's super capable from the Gigabyte range. Got doublers and all that, good cooling, works really well, really high quality ISL chips. In fact, it is only Gigabyte who took this opportunity to update their Z370 range with a fresh new lineup of Z390 boards. Now, you could argue that, well, they were in most need of an upgrade. Their Z370 boards weren't particularly good, but it is great to see them correcting that previous mistake with a stellar range of Z390 motherboards. That said, even Gigabyte's entry-level board and, well, their entire entry-level lineup, everything priced below $170 US, is kind of a make-do situation with the 9900K. So the VRM seen on this board is then copy and pasted onto their more expensive $140 Gaming X and M gaming models, as well as the $150 Gaming SLI. So it's not until you pony up $170 US for the Aorus Elite that you're really getting a high quality VRM that's more than capable of tackling the 9900K. So I think it's time to face facts. Tim has a Lego addiction, and entry-level Z390 motherboards just shouldn't exist. And on that note, I am going to end this one. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe for more content, and if you appreciate the work we do at Unboxed, then consider supporting us on Patreon. That enables us to buy motherboards such as this one for testing, so very helpful and much appreciated. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I will see you again next time.